The wind howled through Pine Ridge Mountains like a wounded animal, carrying with it the scent of approaching winter and the weight of 18 years of solitude. Jake Morrison stood at the edge of his cabin's weathered porch, his calloused hands gripping a steaming cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. His beard, now more silver than brown, caught the morning frost as his eyes scanned the valley below, where civilization dared to creep closer each passing season. Tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. He hadn't spoken to another soul in 3 months, hadn't seen a woman's face in longer than that, and hadn't witnessed a genuine smile from anyone in so long that he sometimes wondered if he'd imagined what joy looked like. The mountains had become his sanctuary and his prison, a place where memories couldn't follow and where the echoes of his past grew fainter with each brutal winter that carved deeper lines into his weathered face. But today, something was different. Today, the wind carried more than just the promise of snow. It carried the distant sound of crying, so faint that Jake almost dismissed it as another trick of the mountain acoustics that had fooled him countless times before. Yet as he strained his ears against the morning stillness, the sound came again, more desperate now, more human. The autumn of 1885 had painted Colorado territory in shades of gold and crimson, but Jake Morrison saw only the approaching gray of another endless winter. 18 years of self-imposed exile in the Pine Ridge Mountains had hardened him into something barely recognizable as the man he'd once been. His cabin, perched on a rocky outcropping 2,000 feet above Clearwater Valley, might as well have been on the moon for all the human contact it afforded him. Jake had built the place with his own hands after returning from the war, using timber he'd felled himself and stones he'd hauled up the treacherous mountain paths one backbreaking load at a time. It was a fortress of solitude designed to keep the world out and his demons in. The nearest neighbor was Doc Patterson in Cedar Falls, a full day's ride down terrain that would challenge even the most experienced mountain man, and Jake preferred it that way. This particular morning had started like every other for the past 6,570 days. Jake rose before dawn, tended to his small herd of goats, checked his trap lines, and settled into the routine of survival that had kept him alive when nothing else seemed worth living for. He'd grown accustomed to the silence, had even learned to find a strange comfort in it. Words, after all, were meant for people who had something to say to other people, and Jake Morrison had lost that luxury long ago. The coffee in his tin cup had been brewed from beans he'd traded for in town 3 months prior, during his last reluctant venture into what passed for civilization in these parts. He'd spoken perhaps a dozen words during that entire transaction, enough to conduct his business and nothing more. The shopkeeper, Mrs. Henderson, had tried to engage him in conversation about the weather, about the railroad surveyors who'd been poking around the valley, about anything that might crack the shell of isolation he wore like armor. Jake had nodded, politely, paid for his supplies, and disappeared back into the mountains before the sun had reached its peak. But this morning, as he stood on his porch watching the mist rise from the valley below, something shattered the cathedral silence of his mountain sanctuary. It came first as a whisper on the wind, so faint that Jake's rational mind dismissed it as the cry of a hawk or the complaint of wind through a crevice in the rocks. He'd heard such phantom sounds before, auditory mirages born from too much solitude, and too many nights spent listening to nothing but his own breathing. Yet as he stood there, coffee growing cold in his hands, the sound came again. This time there was no mistaking it for anything other than what it was, the unmistakable sound of human distress echoing up from somewhere in the maze of canyons and ridges that surrounded his mountain home. Jake's first instinct was to retreat inside, to close his door and his ears to whatever tragedy was unfolding below. 18 years of solitude had taught him that involvement with other people's problems led only to heartache and complications he was no longer equipped to handle. He'd made that mistake once before, had allowed himself to care about someone else's welfare, and the consequences had driven him to these mountains in the first place. The memory of that failure still haunted him, still whispered accusations in his ear during the long winter nights when the wind sounded too much like voices calling his name. No, Jake Morrison had learned his lesson about playing the hero, had paid the price for thinking he could make a difference in someone else's life. But the crying continued, carried on gusts of wind that seemed determined to deposit the sound directly into his consciousness. It was a woman's voice, he realized with a start, that sent unexpected electricity through his chest. He hadn't heard a woman cry in so long that the sound struck him as both foreign and achingly familiar, like a half-remembered song from childhood that suddenly surfaces from the depths of memory. Jake set down his coffee cup with hands that trembled slightly, though he told himself it was just the morning cold seeping through his worn flannel shirt. He moved to the edge of his porch, straining his ears against the mountain silence, trying to pinpoint the source of the distress. The acoustics of the mountains were tricky, sounds bouncing off canyon walls and ridges in ways that could make a whisper seem like a shout, or make something happening miles away sound like it was just around the next boulder. The voice came again, clearer now, and Jake felt his carefully constructed walls of indifference beginning to crack. There was something in that cry that spoke to a part of him he'd thought was long dead, a part that remembered what it felt like to want to help, to make a difference, to be the kind of man who didn't turn his back on someone in need. It was a dangerous feeling, one that threatened to undermine 18 years of carefully cultivated emotional isolation. Jake retreated inside his cabin, trying to focus on the morning's tasks that awaited him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The goats needed milking, the firewood supply needed restocking before the next storm, and there were a dozen other chores that required his attention. He moved through these tasks with mechanical precision, the same way he'd moved through every day for the past 18 years, but his mind kept drifting back to that voice on the wind. By mid-morning, the crying had stopped, replaced by the normal symphony of mountain sounds: wind through pine needles, the distant call of an eagle, the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush. Jake told himself he was relieved that whatever crisis had generated those sounds had resolved itself without his intervention. He'd been wise to stay out of it, wise to maintain the boundaries that had kept him sane and safe for nearly 2 decades. But as he worked, splitting wood with the rhythmic precision of long practice, Jake found his gaze drawn repeatedly to the valley below. Clearwater Valley stretched out beneath him like a patchwork quilt of gold and green, bisected by the silver ribbon of Silver Creek and dotted with the occasional homestead or ranch building. It was beautiful country, he had to admit, the kind of place that drew people west with dreams of new beginnings and fresh starts. Jake had been one of those dreamers once, had come to Colorado territory with his younger brother Ben after the war, full of plans to build something lasting, something worthy of the sacrifice they'd both made in service to their country. They'd filed claims on adjacent parcels, had spent their first winter planning the ranch they would build together, the life they would carve out of the wilderness through hard work and determination. But dreams, Jake had learned, were fragile things, easily shattered by the harsh realities of frontier life. Ben had been everything Jake was not: optimistic where Jake was cautious, trusting where Jake was suspicious, quick to laugh where Jake was slow to smile. Ben had possessed an infectious enthusiasm for life that had made even the hardest days seem manageable, had been the kind of person who could find humor in adversity and hope in the darkest circumstances. The memory of his brother's laughter still echoed through Jake's mind sometimes, especially on mornings like this when the wind carried sounds that seemed to come from another world. Ben would have been the first one down the mountain to investigate those cries, would have saddled his horse without a second thought and ridden toward whatever trouble might be brewing in the valley below. Ben had never met a stranger, never encountered a problem he didn't think he could solve with enough effort and goodwill. Jake paused in his wood splitting, the axe handle smooth and familiar in his calloused hands. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent 18 years trying to escape the memory of his brother's compassion, only to find himself confronted with a situation that demanded exactly the kind of response Ben would have given without hesitation. The crying had stirred something in Jake that he'd thought was safely buried, something that remembered what it felt like to care about the welfare of others. As the sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the mountainside, Jake found himself walking to the edge of his property, to the lookout point where he could see the farthest into the valley below. He told himself he was just checking the weather, just making sure no early snow was building in the western peaks, but he knew he was lying. He was looking for signs of whatever had generated those cries, for some indication of whether intervention might still be needed. The valley seemed peaceful enough from his elevated vantage point. Silver Creek wound its lazy way through the grasslands, catching the sunlight like scattered diamonds. The Campbell Ranch spread across the prime bottomland, its buildings looking like toys from this distance, smoke rising from the main house chimney in a perfectly straight line that indicated calm weather. Everything looked normal, tranquil, untouched by whatever crisis had sent those desperate sounds echoing through the mountains. Jake was about to turn back to his cabin when a glint of sunlight off metal caught his eye. There, near the bend in Silver Creek, where it curved around a stand of cottonwoods, something that didn't belong to the natural landscape reflected the morning sun. It was too far away and too small for Jake to make out any details, but it was definitely artificial, definitely out of place in the wilderness setting. His hands moved to the brass telescope he kept on the lookout point, a relic from his army days that had served him well in keeping track of the comings and goings in the valley below. Through the lens, the distant object resolved into the unmistakable shape of a wagon, though one that seemed to be listing at an odd angle, as if one of its wheels had broken or become mired in the soft ground near the creek. Jake adjusted the focus, trying to make out more details. The wagon appeared to be a simple farm conveyance, the kind used by homesteaders to transport goods and family members across the rough terrain of the territory. But there was something wrong with the scene, something that made Jake's experienced I narrow with concern. The wagon's position suggested it had veered off the main trail that followed the creek, had ended up in the soft ground near the water's edge where it would be difficult to extract without help. More troubling still, Jake could see no sign of the horses that should have been pulling the wagon, nor any indication of human activity around the stranded vehicle. The morning sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, but even through the telescope's magnification, Jake could detect no movement, no sign that anyone was attempting to deal with whatever misfortune had befallen the wagon's occupants. The crying he'd heard earlier began to make more sense now. Someone had been in that wagon when it became stranded, someone who had called out for help that was too far away to arrive, too isolated to be heard by anyone except a hermit living on a mountain peak 2,000 feet above the valley floor. Jake lowered the telescope, his mind working through the implications of what he'd observed. If the wagon had been stranded since the previous evening, its occupants would have spent a cold night in the open, exposed to the elements and whatever predators might be drawn to signs of distress. If they were injured, if the accident that had stranded the wagon had also caused harm to horses or people, then time was becoming a critical factor. The nearest help was the Campbell Ranch, but that was still several miles away, and Jake had no way of knowing if anyone there was aware of the situation. Jake found himself walking back toward his cabin, his mind wrestling with a decision he'd thought he'd never have to make again. 18 years of isolation had been his shield against exactly this kind of moral dilemma, this conflict between self-preservation and the obligation to help a fellow human being in distress. He'd built his life around the principle of non-involvement, around the belief that he'd lost the right to play hero the day his choices had led to tragedy for the person he'd cared about most. But as he reached his cabin and began automatically preparing for the day's routine, Jake couldn't shake the image of that stranded wagon or the memory of those desperate cries echoing through the mountain air. Someone down there needed help, and while Jake Morrison might have forgotten how to be part of civilized society, he hadn't quite forgotten what it meant to be human. The decision, when it finally came, felt less like a choice than like an inevitability, as if 18 years of careful isolation had been building toward this single moment of reconnection with the world he'd left behind. Jake saddled his horse, a sturdy mountain-bred mare named Storm who'd been his only companion through the long years of exile, and began the treacherous descent toward whatever awaited him in the valley below. As he rode, Jake tried to prepare himself for human contact, tried to remember how conversations worked, how to speak to someone who wasn't a horse or a goat or the echo of his own voice bouncing off canyon walls. He realized with something approaching panic that he couldn't remember the last time he'd spoken more than a few words at a time, couldn't recall what his voice sounded like when it wasn't hoarse from disuse or roughened by the mountain cold. The path down from Jake's cabin was treacherous under the best of circumstances, a narrow track that he'd carved into the mountainside over years of careful work. In places, it was barely wide enough for a horse and rider, with steep drops on one side and sheer rock faces on the other. Storm navigated the route with the sure-footed confidence of an animal that had made the journey many times. But Jake found himself more nervous than usual, his hands tense on the reins as he contemplated what awaited him at the bottom. By the time he reached the valley floor, the sun had climbed to its midday position, casting short shadows and bathing the landscape in the bright, clear light that made Colorado territory famous among painters and photographers. The stranded wagon was still where Jake had spotted it from his mountain perch, though up close he could see details that the telescope had missed. The wagon was definitely mired in the soft ground near Silver Creek, its right rear wheel sunk up to the hub in mud that must have been churned up by the recent autumn rains. The vehicle itself appeared to be in good condition, suggesting that whatever had caused it to leave the main trail hadn't been a catastrophic mechanical failure. More puzzling still, Jake could see no immediate sign of the horses that should have been pulling it, though the harness traces were still attached to the wagon tongue, suggesting the animals had been unhitched rather than having broken free in panic. It was only as Jake drew closer that he saw her, and the sight hit him with the force of a physical blow. A woman sat on the wagon's tailgate, her back turned toward him, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs that explained the crying he'd heard, echoing through the mountains that morning. She was dressed in simple traveling clothes, a dark skirt and white blouse that had seen better days, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders in a way that suggested she'd either slept in the open or had been through some kind of ordeal that had left her disheveled and distraught. Jake reined in Storm at a respectful distance, suddenly aware that his approach might frighten someone who was already in distress. He cleared his throat, wincing at the harsh sound his voice made after months of disuse, and called out as gently as he could manage. "Ma'am, are you hurt? Do you need assistance?" The woman's shoulders stiffened at the sound of his voice, and she turned slowly to face him, revealing a face that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps in her mid-20s, with dark hair and eyes that held a depth of sadness that seemed to echo his own. But it was her expression that struck him most forcefully, the complete absence of any emotion that might be mistaken for happiness or hope. She wasn't crying now, Jake realized. The tears had stopped sometime during his descent from the mountain, leaving behind only the hollow look of someone who had exhausted her capacity for emotional expression. When she looked at him, there was no relief at the sight of potential rescue, no spark of gratitude or even curiosity about this strange, bearded man who had appeared out of nowhere to offer help. "I'm not hurt," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not in any way that matters." The words carried a weight of meaning that Jake recognized all too well, the kind of statement that spoke to wounds that went far deeper than anything that could be seen or bandaged. He'd heard similar words from his own lips during the dark days after Ben's death, had felt the same hollow conviction that some kinds of damage were beyond repair. Jake dismounted carefully, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening as he approached the stranded wagon. Up close, he could see that it was indeed stuck fast in the muddy ground near the creek, but it didn't appear to be damaged beyond recovery. With the right equipment and approach, it could probably be extracted without too much difficulty. "I'm Jake Morrison," he said, removing his hat in a gesture of politeness that felt rusty from disuse. "I live up on the mountain. I thought someone might need help." The woman studied him with those sad, dark eyes, taking in his weathered appearance, his unkempt beard, his clothes that spoke of years spent in solitude. Jake was suddenly aware of how he must look to someone from civilized society, like some kind of mountain savage who'd wandered down from the wilderness. He almost turned around and left right then, almost retreated back to the safety of his isolated cabin where he didn't have to worry about human judgment or social expectations. But then the woman spoke again, and something in her voice kept him rooted in place. "Emma Clark," she said simply, "and I suppose I do need help, though I'm not sure anyone can provide the kind I really need." The way she said it, with such quiet resignation and acceptance of her circumstances, struck Jake as both heartbreaking and familiar. Here was someone who understood what it meant to be truly alone, who had reached that place of emotional exhaustion where hope seemed like a luxury rather than a necessity. Jake looked around the scene, taking in the details that might explain how Emma Clark had ended up stranded by Silver Creek with no horses and no apparent means of rescue. The wagon's contents were still secured under a canvas tarp, suggesting that whatever had separated her from her animals, it hadn't been the work of thieves or hostile parties. The harness was neatly arranged, indicating that the horses had been deliberately unhitched rather than having broken free in panic. "Where were your horses headed?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Emma gestured vaguely. "Toward the east, where the main trail wound its way toward Cedar Falls and the established settlements beyond. They ran off during the night," she said. "Spooked by something. Wolves, maybe, or just the sound of the wind. I woke up this morning and they were gone." Jake nodded, understanding the situation now. Horses left to graze overnight sometimes did bolt when frightened, though it was unusual for them to abandon a familiar wagon and human companion unless something had truly terrified them. Still, it wasn't unheard of, especially in country where predators and unexpected weather could turn a peaceful night into a struggle for survival. "Where were you headed?" he asked, already beginning to formulate a plan for how he might help extract the wagon from its muddy predicament. "Clearwater Valley," Emma replied. "There's supposed to be work there, at one of the ranches, Campbell Ranch, I think it was called." Jake's eyebrows rose slightly at this information. The Campbell Ranch was indeed the largest spread in the valley, and Henry and Ruth Campbell were known for their kindness toward travelers and their willingness to help those down on their luck. If Emma had been hired by the Campbells, then her situation was less dire than it might have appeared. Help was only a few miles away once they could get her wagon mobile again. "The Campbells are good people," Jake said, surprised by the sound of his own voice engaging in actual conversation. "They'll treat you fair." Emma nodded, but there was no enthusiasm in her expression, no indication that the prospect of reaching her destination filled her with any particular hope or anticipation. She looked like someone going through the motions of living without any real investment in the outcome, someone who had learned to expect disappointment and was guarding against any feeling that might leave her vulnerable to further hurt. Jake recognized the expression because he'd seen it in his own reflection for 18 years, had perfected the art of emotional numbness that Emma seemed to have mastered. The recognition created an unexpected kinship between them, a silent understanding that spoke louder than any words they might exchange. "Well," Jake said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. "Let's see about getting you unstuck." Part 2. The aftermath and drift. 3 years had passed since the incident that drove Jake Morrison into the mountains. 3 years of watching the seasons change from his solitary perch above Clearwater Valley. The war had ended a decade before. But for Jake, peace had remained elusive, always just beyond his grasp like morning mist that dissipated the moment he tried to hold it. The cabin he'd built had become both sanctuary and prison, its walls holding back the world while trapping him with memories that refused to fade. Each day blended into the next in a careful routine designed to keep his mind occupied and his heart safely numb. He rose before dawn, tended his animals, maintained his equipment, and watched the sun arc across the Colorado sky with the detached interest of someone observing life from a great distance. Jake had perfected the art of existing without truly living, of moving through each day like a ghost haunting his own life. He spoke only to his horse Storm and his small herd of goats, conversations that required no responses and demanded no emotional investment. The sound of his own voice had become foreign to him, rough and unused, like a tool left to rust in the weather. The isolation had changed him in ways he was only dimly aware of. His hands, once quick to gesture and express, now remained still, at his sides and less engaged in necessary work. His face, which Ben had always said was too quick to smile, had settled into permanent lines of stoic resignation. Even his eyes, once bright with curiosity and humor, had dulled to the color of winter storms, reflecting nothing but the endless gray of emotional emptiness. Food had become fuel, nothing more. Jake ate what he needed to maintain his strength, cooked simple meals that required no thought or planning. The elaborate Sunday dinners he and Ben had shared, filled with laughter and plans for the future, were memories he couldn't afford to indulge. Instead, he consumed beans and hardtack and whatever game he could trap mechanical sustenance for a man who had forgotten what it meant to take pleasure in simple things. Sleep, when it came, brought no rest. His dreams were populated by faces he'd tried to forget, by conversations that replayed endlessly in his mind, by the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade. Jake had learned to function on a few hours of fitful rest, his body adapting to the punishment he inflicted upon it. Through sheer force of will, dawn always came as a relief, bringing with it the blessed distraction of physical labor and the illusion of purpose. The seasons had become his calendar, marking the passage of time in ways that required no human interaction. Spring brought the melting snow and the annual ritual of repairing winter damage to his cabin and outbuildings. Summer meant long days, of gathering and preserving food for the harsh months ahead, of maintaining the trails that connected his mountain home to the world below. Fall was preparation time, stocking firewood and supplies, checking equipment, and making sure everything was ready for the siege of winter that would cut him off from civilization for months at a time. But it was winter that Jake had learned to treasure most, the season when the outside world truly disappeared behind walls of snow and ice. During those long, dark months, he could pretend that he was the only person left alive, that the weight of other people's expectations and judgments had been buried under the same drifts that made travel impossible. Winter gave him permission to be as isolated as he felt, to match his external circumstances to his internal landscape. The newspapers that occasionally made their way to Cedar Falls spoke of progress and expansion, of railroads pushing west and territories becoming states, of a nation healing from the wounds of civil war and growing stronger through adversity. Jake read these accounts with the detached interest of someone observing events on another planet, unable to connect the optimistic descriptions to his own experience of a world that seemed determined to punish anyone foolish enough to hope for better. Letters from old Army friends had stopped coming after the first year, when Jake's failure to respond had finally convinced them that whatever man they'd known during the war was gone forever. He'd burned the last few unopened, watching the paper curl and blacken in his fireplace with the same emotional numbness he brought to everything else in his carefully controlled existence. Connection required vulnerability, and vulnerability led to the kind of pain Jake had sworn never to endure again. The few times necessity forced him into town, Jake moved through Cedar Falls like a specter, conducting his business with the minimum number of words required and disappearing back into the mountains before anyone could attempt real conversation. The townspeople had learned to leave him alone, understanding that whatever had driven Jake Morrison into the wilderness was not something that welcomed discussion or sympathy. Mrs. Henderson at the general store had tried at first, offering small kindnesses and gentle inquiries about his welfare that Jake had met with polite but firm deflection. Doc Patterson, who'd known Jake during his brief time as a Valley resident, had made a few attempts to draw him out, to offer whatever help a medical man might provide for wounds that weren't visible to the naked eye. But Jake had perfected the art of appearing functional while remaining fundamentally unreachable, of meeting social expectations without actually engaging in human connection. The children of Cedar Falls had created their own mythology around the hermit on the mountain, whispered stories of a wild man who lived among the peaks and spoke to animals in their own language. Some claimed he'd been driven mad by the war, others that he was hiding from the law or nursing a broken heart that had never healed. The truth, Jake knew, was both simpler and more complex than any story they might invent. He was just a man who had learned that caring about anything beyond his own survival was a luxury he couldn't afford. His brother Ben had been the opposite. In every way that mattered, quick to laugh and slow to anger, generous with his trust and boundless in his optimism about human nature. Ben had seen potential for good in everyone he met, had believed that most problems could be solved through honest conversation and genuine effort. He'd been the kind of person who made friends effortlessly, who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with a dozen new companions. Ben's easy charm had been both blessing and curse, drawing people to him like moths to flame while making him vulnerable to those who might exploit his trusting nature. He'd never learned to guard his heart the way Jake had during the war, never developed the cynical armor that had kept Jake alive during 4 years of seeing the worst that humanity had to offer. Ben had remained pure in a way that Jake both envied and feared, untouched by the kind of experiences that taught hard lessons about the price of caring too much. The contrast between them had become more pronounced after their return from the war, as Jake struggled to readjust to civilian life, while Ben seemed to slip back into peacetime existence as easily as putting on comfortable old clothes. Ben had plans for their ranch, dreams of building something lasting and worthwhile, of creating a legacy that would honor the friends they'd lost and the sacrifices they'd made. His enthusiasm had been infectious, his vision compelling enough to convince Jake that maybe, just maybe, they could build something good from the ashes of what they'd experienced. But dreams, Jake had learned, were dangerous things for men who'd seen too much of the world's capacity for cruelty. Hope was a weakness that left a man vulnerable to disappointment and despair, a luxury that could be stripped away in an instant by the harsh realities of frontier life. Ben had never learned that lesson, had never understood that sometimes the kindest thing a man could do was to stop believing in happy endings. The incident that had driven Jake into the mountains replayed itself in his mind with relentless clarity, every detail preserved in perfect, torturous precision. He could still hear Ben's voice calling out in the darkness, still feel the weight of the decision that had changed everything, still taste the bitter ash of consequences that couldn't be undone. The memory was a wound that refused to heal, a constant reminder of what happened when a man allowed himself to care about anything beyond his own survival. Jake had tried drinking himself into oblivion during those first months after Ben's death, had spent weeks in a whiskey-soaked haze that dulled the edges of his pain without actually touching its source. But alcohol had only postponed the reckoning, had merely delayed the moment when he would have to face the full weight of his guilt and grief. Eventually, even the whiskey had stopped working, leaving him with nothing but the clear, cold truth of his own responsibility for the tragedy that had claimed his brother's life. The mountains had offered the only escape that made sense, a place where Jake could disappear from the world that held too many reminders of what he'd lost and what he'd failed to protect. Here, among the peaks and valleys of Colorado territory, he could construct a life that demanded nothing more than basic survival, that asked no questions about the past and offered no false promises about the future. His daily routines had become rituals of forgetfulness, carefully structured activities that kept his mind occupied without allowing time for dangerous thoughts or feelings. Jake could milk his goats, tend his garden, repair his equipment, and maintain his cabin without ever engaging the parts of himself that had once been capable of joy or hope or love. He'd become a master of emotional compartmentalization, of existing in the present moment without allowing his thoughts to drift toward either painful memories or impossible dreams. The physical demands of mountain life helped in their own way, providing exhaustion that made sleep possible and challenge that kept his body strong even as his spirit withered. Jake had always been a physical man, someone who thought best while working with his hands, and the endless tasks required by frontier survival gave him something to focus on besides the ache in his chest that no amount of time seemed able to heal. But even in the depths of his self-imposed exile, Jake couldn't entirely silence the part of himself that remembered what it felt like to be connected to another human being, to care about someone else's welfare more than his own survival. That voice had grown quieter over the years, muffled by routine and discipline and the sheer force of his will, but it had never completely disappeared. It whispered to him sometimes in the quiet moments between sleeping and waking, reminded him of laughter and conversation and the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with someone whose company he enjoyed. The voice had been particularly insistent lately, perhaps triggered by the changing season or the approaching anniversary of Ben's death, perhaps simply the result of 3 years of accumulated loneliness finally reaching some critical mass that couldn't be ignored. Jake had found himself pausing in his work to listen to sounds from the valley below, had caught himself wondering about the lives of the people who lived in the scattered homesteads and ranches visible from his mountain perch. He'd even considered, in moments of weakness, making the journey down to Cedar Falls for something more than basic supplies, perhaps lingering long enough to hear news of the outside world or to engage in the kind of casual conversation that had once come so naturally to him. But each time the impulse arose, Jake had crushed it with reminders of why he'd chosen isolation in the first place, with memories of the pain that came from allowing himself to become invested in other people's lives. The crying that morning had broken through his defenses in a way that nothing else had managed in 3 years of solitude. There had been something in that distant voice that spoke to the part of him he'd thought was safely buried, something that reminded him of his own capacity for empathy and compassion. For a few moments, standing on his cabin porch with the wind carrying that desperate sound to his ears, Jake had felt like the man he'd been before Ben's death, the man who would have saddled his horse without hesitation and ridden toward whatever trouble might be brewing in the valley below. The feeling had been both exhilarating and terrifying, a reminder of emotions he'd spent 3 years learning to suppress, of connections he'd deliberately severed in order to protect himself from further hurt. But as he'd stood there listening to those cries echo through the mountain air, Jake had realized that his carefully constructed walls of indifference weren't as impermeable as he'd believed. Something was leaking through, some stubborn remnant of the man he'd once been that refused to be completely extinguished. Part 3. The unexpected encounter. The descent from Jake's mountain cabin to the valley floor was treacherous under the best of circumstances, but today the familiar path seemed fraught with additional dangers. Not from the terrain itself, which Jake knew as well as the lines on his own hands, but from the growing certainty that he was making a mistake, that his 3 years of hard-won isolation were about to be shattered by whatever awaited him at the bottom of the mountain. Storm picked her way carefully down the narrow trail, her hooves finding purchase on rock faces that would have challenged a less experienced mountain horse. Jake had raised her from a foal, had trained her specifically for this kind of work, and she moved with the confidence of an animal that trusted completely in her rider's judgment. If only Jake felt the same confidence in his own decisions. But second-guessing himself had become a luxury he couldn't afford once he'd committed to the journey downward. The wagon became more visible as he descended, and with it the details that his telescope had missed from the mountain heights. It was definitely stuck, its rear wheel sunk deep in the soft mud near Silver Creek, where recent rains had turned the normally solid ground into a treacherous marsh. But there were other details that troubled Jake's experienced eye, signs that suggested this wasn't a simple case of a traveler taking a wrong turn in unfamiliar territory. The wagon's position indicated that it had left the main trail deliberately, as if its driver had been trying to reach the creek for water or to make camp for the night. The harness was too neatly arranged for horses that had bolted in panic, suggesting instead that the animals had been deliberately unhitched, perhaps, in an attempt to prevent them from injuring themselves while their owner dealt with the wagon's predicament. Most telling of all, the personal belongings visible in the wagon bed showed no signs of having been disturbed by weather or wild animals, indicating that this situation was recent, probably no more than a day old. As Jake drew closer, he could make out more details about the woman sitting on the wagon's tailgate, and each new observation added to his growing sense that this encounter was going to be more complicated than a simple rescue operation. She sat with the perfect stillness of someone who had exhausted all her options and was simply waiting for whatever might happen next, not the restless energy of someone actively seeking solutions to her predicament. Her clothes, while travel-worn, were of good quality, suggesting that she wasn't a destitute wanderer but someone who had fallen on hard times or found herself in unexpected circumstances. Her posture spoke of education and breeding, the kind of upright carriage that came from proper schooling and social expectations. But there was something in the set of her shoulders that suggested those advantages hadn't protected her from significant hardship. Most intriguing of all was her reaction to his approach. Jake had expected relief, gratitude, perhaps even a bit of wariness at the sight of a strange man emerging from the wilderness. But Emma Clark's response was none of these things. She watched his approach with the detached interest of someone observing events that didn't quite concern her, as if she were viewing the scene from a great distance rather than being its central participant. When Jake finally reined in Storm and dismounted near the stranded wagon, he found himself at a loss for words in a way that had nothing to do with his 3 years of self-imposed silence. There was something about Emma's presence that commanded attention while simultaneously holding the world at arm's length, a combination that Jake recognized from his own mirror but had never encountered in another person. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice emerging rougher than he'd intended after months of disuse. "I heard crying from up the mountain. Thought someone might be in trouble." Emma turned to look at him fully for the first time, and Jake felt something shift in his chest at the sight of her face. She was younger than he'd expected, probably. No more than 25, with dark hair that had escaped from what must have once been a neat arrangement and brown eyes that held depths of sadness he recognized all too well. But it was her expression that struck him most forcefully, the complete absence of hope or expectation that seemed to have settled over her features like a veil. "The crying stopped hours ago," she said simply, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone who had moved beyond emotional expression into a realm of pure factual observation. There didn't seem much point in continuing. The statement hit Jake with unexpected force, not because of what it revealed about Emma's circumstances, but because of what it revealed about her state of mind. Here was someone who had reached the same emotional wasteland that Jake had been inhabiting for 3 years, someone who had learned to function without hope or joy or any of the other feelings that most people considered essential to human existence. Jake studied the scene more carefully, taking in details that might explain how Emma had ended up in this predicament. The wagon was well maintained, but not new, the kind of practical conveyance that suggested its owner was accustomed to traveling long distances over rough terrain. The belongings visible under the canvas cover appeared to be personal possessions rather than trade goods, indicating that Emma was relocating rather than conducting business in the territory. "Where were you headed?" Jake asked, though he was beginning to suspect that the destination might be less important than whatever Emma was trying to leave behind. "Campbell Ranch," Emma replied without enthusiasm. "Mrs. Campbell offered me work through a correspondence agency, teaching their grandchildren, helping with household management, that sort of thing." Jake nodded, familiar with the Campbell family's reputation for kindness toward those in need of employment or assistance. Henry and Ruth Campbell had been among the first settlers in Clearwater Valley, had built their ranch from nothing through hard work and determination, and were known throughout the territory for their willingness to help others achieve similar success. If Emma had been hired by the Campbells, then her immediate future was secure, at least in terms of basic necessities. But there was something in the way she spoke about the position that suggested it was more escape than opportunity, more last resort than career choice. Emma's voice carried the tone of someone who had exhausted other options and was settling for whatever remained available, not the enthusiasm of someone looking forward to new challenges and possibilities. "The Campbells are good people," Jake offered, surprised by his own impulse to provide reassurance to this stranger. "They'll treat you fairly." Emma's only response was a slight nod that acknowledged his words without indicating whether she found them comforting or irrelevant. Her attention seemed to drift away from him toward the creek, where the morning sun created patterns of light and shadow on the moving water that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. Jake found himself studying her profile while she was distracted, trying to read the story written in the lines of her face and the set of her posture. There were no obvious signs of physical hardship or abuse, no indication that she was fleeing from immediate danger or desperate circumstances. Instead, Emma carried herself with the careful control of someone who had learned to manage pain through sheer force of will, who had constructed walls around her emotions that were every bit as impermeable as Jake's own defenses. The recognition created an unexpected kinship between them, a silent understanding that spoke louder than any conversation they might have attempted. Jake had spent 3 years perfecting the art of emotional numbness, of moving through the world without allowing it to touch him in any meaningful way, and he could see that same skill reflected in Emma's carefully blank expression. "Well," Jake said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them like a bridge neither seemed ready to cross. "Let's see about getting you unstuck and on your way to the Campbells." He moved toward the rear of the wagon to assess the situation more closely, noting the way the wheel had sunk into the soft ground and the angle at which the vehicle had settled. It was definitely recoverable with the right approach and equipment, though it would require some careful maneuvering to avoid making the situation worse. "I tried digging it out myself," Emma said, her voice carrying no expectation that Jake might succeed where she had failed. "The mud just keeps flowing back in." Jake nodded, understanding the problem immediately. The ground near the creek was deceptive, appearing solid on the surface while concealing softer earth underneath that could swallow a wagon wheel and hold it fast. The recent rains had only made the situation worse, saturating the soil until it became a trap for unwary travelers. Need to get some leverage under the wheel, Jake explained, already formulating a plan. Rocks and branches to give it something solid to grip on. Should be able to work it free without too much trouble. He began gathering materials from the surrounding area, selecting stones of the right size and shape to provide a foundation for the wagon wheel, while Emma watched with the detached interest of someone observing events that didn't quite concern her. Jake found himself stealing glances at her as he worked, intrigued despite himself by her unusual combination of obvious intelligence and apparent emotional disconnection. "You can help," Jake said after a few minutes of working alone, realizing that Emma's participation might be necessary for the plan to succeed. "Need someone to guide the horses when we get them hitched back up." "I don't have horses," Emma replied matter-of-factly. "They ran off during the night. That's why I'm stuck here instead of continuing on to the ranch." Jake paused in his work, processing this new information. Horses didn't usually abandon a familiar wagon and human companion unless something had seriously frightened them. But Emma spoke of their departure with the same flat acceptance she brought to everything else, as if the loss of her animals was just another disappointment in a series too long to catalog. "What spooked them?" Jake asked, though he suspected the answer might be less important than the fact that Emma now faced a journey to the Campbell Ranch with no means of transportation except her own feet. "I don't know," Emma said with a slight shrug. "I woke up this morning and they were gone. The harness was still attached to the wagon, so I assumed they broke free during the night. Wolves, maybe, or just the sound of the wind in the trees." Jake nodded, though something about the explanation troubled him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Horses were creatures of habit and routine, unlikely to abandon familiar surroundings unless driven by genuine terror or physical necessity. The fact that they had broken free from their harness rather than simply wandering off while hobbled suggested panic rather than simple restlessness. "We'll use my horse to pull the wagon free," Jake decided, already adjusting his plan to accommodate the changed circumstances. Storm's strong enough to handle the load, and she's used to difficult terrain. As he worked to position rocks and branches around the wagon wheel, Jake found himself drawn into conversation despite his usual preference for silence. There was something about Emma's presence that made words seem necessary, as if the weight of their shared emotional isolation required some kind of verbal acknowledgement to make it bearable. "You come far?" he asked, keeping his voice casual as he maneuvered a particularly large stone into position. "Missouri," Emma replied. "Left there about 3 weeks ago. Been traveling ever since." The simple answer raised a dozen new questions in Jake's mind, but he resisted the impulse to probe deeper into Emma's history. He understood better than most the desire to leave the past buried, to focus on the immediate demands of survival rather than dwelling on choices that couldn't be unmade or losses that couldn't be recovered. Instead, he concentrated on the physical problem at hand, using his knowledge of leverage and mechanics to create a foundation that would allow Storm to pull the wagon free without causing additional damage. The work was familiar and comforting, requiring just enough concentration to keep his mind occupied while allowing for the kind of easy conversation that had once come naturally to him. "What brings you all the way out to Colorado territory?" Jake asked, positioning the last of the support stones beneath the wagon wheel. "Fresh start," Emma said simply, her tone suggesting that the topic wasn't open for further discussion. Sometimes a person needs to go as far as possible from where they started. Jake understood that sentiment completely, though his own escape had been measured in altitude rather than distance. The mountains had provided him with the same thing Emma was apparently seeking through geographic relocation, a place where the past couldn't follow and the future demanded nothing more than basic survival. "Territory's good for that," he agreed, beginning to rig Storm's harness to the wagon tongue. "Plenty of room for people who need space to figure things out." Emma watched his preparations with interest, her first sign of genuine engagement since he'd arrived at the scene of her predicament. Jake found himself working more carefully under her observation, taking extra time to ensure that every connection was secure and properly arranged. "You've done this before," Emma observed, her voice carrying a note of professional appreciation for skilled work. "Enough times," Jake admitted. "Mountain travel teaches you to deal with all kinds of situations. Wagons get stuck, horses get spooked, weather changes faster than you can prepare for it. You learn to improvise or you don't survive very long." As he spoke, Jake realized that this was the longest conversation he'd had with another human being in over a year, and despite his usual preference for solitude, he found himself reluctant to let it end. There was something about Emma's quiet presence that made talking feel natural rather than forced, as if their shared understanding of emotional isolation created a foundation for communication that didn't require the usual social conventions. "Ready to give it a try," Jake announced, having completed his preparations. "Might want to stand clear in case something slips." Emma moved to a safe distance as Jake positioned Storm in front of the wagon and began the careful process of applying tension to the makeshift recovery system. The mare understood the work intuitively, leaning into her harness with steady pressure rather than trying to jerk the wagon free through brute force. For a moment, nothing happened except the gradual tightening of ropes and the soft sound of stones shifting under pressure. Then, with a wet sucking noise that spoke of mud releasing its grip reluctantly, the wagon wheel began to rise from its earthen prison. Jake continued the steady pull until the wheel cleared the muddy hole entirely and the wagon rolled forward onto more solid ground. "There," Jake said with satisfaction, patting Storm's neck in appreciation for her efforts. "Should be able to get you back on the main trail without any more trouble." He expected Emma to express relief or gratitude at her rescue, but her reaction was characteristically muted, a simple nod that acknowledged the successful completion of the task without indicating any particular emotional investment in the outcome. Jake found her response both puzzling and familiar, recognizing in it the same emotional distance he maintained from most aspects of his own life. "Thank you," Emma said after a moment, her words carrying genuine appreciation even if her tone remained carefully neutral. "I wasn't sure what I was going to do." Jake began unhitching Storm from the wagon, his movements automatic while his mind processed the implications of Emma's situation. She was now mobile again, able to continue her journey to the Campbell Ranch, but she was still without horses to pull her wagon or carry her belongings. The nearest settlement was several miles away, too far for a woman traveling alone on foot, especially given the unpredictable weather that characterized Colorado territory in the autumn. "About your horses," Jake said carefully, not wanting to intrude on Emma's privacy while recognizing the practical difficulties she faced. "They probably didn't go far. Horses like familiar territory, and they'll usually circle back toward the last place they remember being fed and watered." Emma considered this information with the same careful attention she'd given to his wagon recovery efforts, weighing the possibility against other factors Jake could only guess at. "How long would it take to find them?" she asked, her question carrying the tone of someone calculating costs and benefits rather than expressing hope or enthusiasm. Jake looked around at the surrounding terrain, mentally mapping the areas where frightened horses might seek shelter or water. The landscape offered several possibilities, from hidden meadows where they might graze to water sources where they would eventually need to drink. "Depends on how far they ran and how spooked they really were," Jake said honestly. "Could be a few hours, could be a day or two. Hard to say without knowing what sent them running in the first place." Emma absorbed this information with a slight nod, her expression revealing nothing about her thoughts or preferences regarding the various options available to her. Jake found himself wanting to offer more concrete assistance, to suggest that he help search for the missing animals or provide transportation to the Campbell Ranch, but his 3 years of self-imposed isolation had left him uncertain about the boundaries of appropriate involvement. The sun had climbed higher during their work on the wagon, casting shorter shadows and promising another warm afternoon before the cooler temperatures of evening set in. Jake realized that whatever decision Emma made about her next steps would need to be implemented soon, before the day grew too late for safe travel through unfamiliar territory. "The Campbell Ranch is about 6 miles from here," Jake said, providing information that might help Emma make an informed choice about her situation. "Good road most of the way, though there are a couple of creek crossings that could be tricky if the water's running high from the recent rains." Emma turned to look in the direction Jake indicated, her gaze following the line of the main trail as it wound its way through the valley toward the distant ranch buildings that were just visible as a cluster of structures against the far hills. 6 miles, she repeated, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone calculating whether such a distance was manageable under her current circumstances. Jake watched her internal debate with growing concern, recognizing in her careful deliberation the same kind of analytical approach he brought to survival decisions in the mountains. But there was something else in Emma's expression, a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion to encompass a deeper kind of fatigue that Jake understood all too well. Standing there beside Silver Creek with the rescued wagon and the missing horses and the uncertain journey ahead, Jake realized that his simple rescue mission had evolved into something more complex, something that would require him to make choices about involvement and responsibility that he'd spent 3 years learning to avoid. Emma's quiet presence and obvious need had awakened something in him that he'd thought was safely buried. Some stubborn remnant of the man he'd been before isolation became his preferred state of existence. For the first time in 3 years, Jake Morrison found himself genuinely concerned about another person's welfare, and the feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying in its implications for the carefully ordered solitude he'd constructed around his life. Part 4. The decision to help. The silence stretched between them as Emma contemplated her options, and Jake found himself caught in an unexpected internal struggle. His rational mind cataloged all the reasons why his involvement should end here. With the wagon freed from the mud and Emma capable of making her own decisions about the journey ahead, he'd done what any decent person would do, had responded to a cry for help and provided assistance within the bounds of common courtesy. Nothing more was required or expected. But standing there in the morning sunlight beside Silver Creek, watching Emma's careful consideration of her limited choices, Jake discovered that 3 years of emotional isolation hadn't completely extinguished his capacity for human concern. There was something about her quiet dignity in the face of adversity, her refusal to seek pity or demand assistance beyond what was freely offered, that spoke to parts of himself he'd thought were permanently buried. Emma's situation was genuinely precarious, regardless of how calmly she seemed to accept it. 6 miles on foot through uncertain terrain, carrying whatever essential belongings she could manage, with no guarantee that she'd reach the Campbell Ranch before nightfall or encounter other travelers who might offer assistance along the way. The autumn weather in Colorado Territory was notoriously unpredictable, capable of shifting from pleasant warmth to life-threatening cold in the space of a few hours. Jake had spent enough time in these mountains to understand the very real dangers that faced travelers caught unprepared by sudden changes in weather or terrain. He'd seen the markers in the cemetery at Cedar Falls that bore silent testimony to the consequences of miscalculation or bad luck, granite reminders that the frontier forgave few mistakes and punished hesitation with swift and permanent finality. "I could take you to the ranch," Jake heard himself say, the words emerging before his conscious mind had fully committed to the offer. "My horse can carry both of us, and it wouldn't take more than a couple of hours." Emma turned to look at him with something approaching surprise, the first genuinely spontaneous expression he'd seen cross her features since his arrival. For a moment, her careful emotional control seemed to waver, revealing beneath it a vulnerability that made her seem younger and more human than her previous detached demeanor had suggested. "You don't need to do that," she said carefully, her voice carrying the tone of someone unaccustomed to accepting help from strangers. "I can manage the walk." Jake studied her face, noting the slight tremor in her voice that suggested Emma's confidence in her ability to manage the journey was less certain than her words indicated. He recognized the pride that made accepting assistance difficult, the same stubborn independence that had driven him into the mountains and kept him there despite the loneliness and isolation that sometimes threatened to overwhelm him. "I'm sure you can," Jake replied, his tone making it clear that he didn't doubt her determination or capability. "But there's no sense in making things harder than they need to be. The ranch isn't that far out of my way." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Jake's mountain cabin was in the opposite direction from the Campbell Ranch, and his usual trips to Cedar Falls followed entirely different routes that avoided the need to traverse the valley floor where his presence might attract unwanted attention or require social interaction he wasn't prepared to handle. But the lie served a purpose, providing Emma with a face-saving way to accept assistance without having to acknowledge that she genuinely needed help. Jake understood the delicate balance of pride and practicality that governed such decisions. Having navigated similar territory countless times during his own struggles to maintain independence, while recognizing the occasional necessity of human cooperation. Emma considered his offer with the same careful deliberation she'd brought to every other aspect of their interaction, weighing factors that Jake could only guess at. Her silence stretched long enough to make him wonder if he'd overstepped some invisible boundary, if his offer of assistance carried implications or obligations that she found unacceptable. "I don't even know your name," Emma said finally, her words carrying the weight of someone recognizing that accepting help from a complete stranger represented a significant departure from whatever rules had previously governed her interactions with the world. "Jake Morrison," he replied, removing his hat in a gesture of formal introduction that felt rusty from years of disuse. "Been living up on the mountain for the past few years. Like I said, I heard you crying this morning and thought someone might need help." Emma studied his face as if trying to read character and intention in the lines carved by weather and solitude, her dark eyes taking in details that Jake suddenly realized might present a troubling picture to someone encountering him for the first time. His beard was unkempt. His clothes showed the wear of someone who valued function over appearance, and his general demeanor probably suggested the kind of rough frontier character that respectable women were taught to avoid. "Emma Clark," she said after a moment, her decision apparently made despite whatever reservations she might harbor about his appearance or circumstances. "And I would be grateful for the ride to the ranch, if you're certain it's not too much trouble." Jake felt an unexpected sense of relief at her acceptance, though he wasn't entirely sure whether his satisfaction stemmed from the resolution of a practical problem or from something deeper, some awakening of the protective instincts that had once been second nature to him but had lain dormant during his years of isolation. "No trouble at all," he assured her, already beginning to formulate the logistics of transporting Emma and whatever belongings she might need to the Campbell Ranch. "We'll need to secure your wagon first, make sure it's safe from weather and animals until you can arrange to have it moved." Emma nodded, turning to survey her possessions with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to making difficult choices about what was essential and what could be left behind. Jake watched this process with professional interest, noting the efficiency with which she sorted through items that clearly held varying degrees of importance to her future survival and comfort. Emma's belongings told a story that Jake found himself piecing together despite his usual reluctance to involve himself in other people's histories. There were books, enough of them to suggest either education or profession that required extensive reading. A small wooden box that she handled with particular care, its contents unknown but obviously precious. Clothing that was practical rather than fashionable, chosen for durability and versatility rather than appearance. A few personal items that spoke of a life lived with attention to small comforts and domestic details. Most telling of all was what wasn't present in Emma's possessions. No photographs or daguerreotypes that might suggest family connections or sentimental attachments to people left behind. No correspondence or letters that might indicate ongoing relationships that required maintenance or attention. No luxury items or expensive accessories that might suggest wealth or social position that could provide security in uncertain circumstances. It was the collection of belongings that belonged to someone starting over, someone who had deliberately pared down their material existence to only what was absolutely necessary for basic survival and professional function. Jake recognized the pattern because he'd followed similar logic when building his mountain retreat, choosing to keep only what served essential purposes while discarding anything that might serve as a reminder of a life he was trying to leave behind. "I'll need the books," Emma said, selecting a small pile of volumes that she judged essential. "And my teaching materials. Mrs. Campbell expects me to begin lessons with her grandchildren as soon as I arrive." Jake nodded, making mental calculations about weight and space as Emma continued her selection process. Storm was strong and sure-footed, capable of carrying 2 people and a reasonable amount of luggage without strain, but there were limits to what could be safely managed on mountain trails that could turn treacherous without warning. "What about the rest?" Jake asked, gesturing toward the items Emma was leaving behind. "It'll be safe enough in the wagon for a few days, but if the weather turns bad or if animals decide to investigate." Emma's expression remained carefully neutral as she considered the potential loss of possessions that represented whatever remained of her previous life. Jake could see her weighing the value of material things against the practicalities of her current situation, making the kind of hard choices that frontier life demanded from everyone sooner or later. "Things are just things," she said finally, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who had already lost more important things than could be replaced by any collection of material possessions. "If they're still here when I can arrange to retrieve them, fine. If not, I'll manage without them." The casual dismissal of her belongings struck Jake as both admirable and troubling, suggesting a relationship with material security that was either remarkably healthy or alarmingly detached. He'd known people during the war who developed similar attitudes toward possessions after losing everything repeatedly to enemy action or military necessity, but Emma's detachment seemed to run deeper than simple practicality. Jake helped Emma secure the wagon against weather and curious animals, using ropes and canvas to create a reasonable barrier against the elements while accepting that determined wildlife or human interference might overcome their precautions. The work provided a comfortable framework for conversation that felt less forced than the careful exchanges they'd shared while assessing her situation. "You mentioned teaching," Jake said as they arranged a tarp over Emma's remaining belongings. "What subject?" "Reading, writing, arithmetic," Emma replied without enthusiasm. "Basic education for children who might not otherwise receive formal schooling." Mrs. Campbell indicated that her grandchildren have been managing with whatever instruction she and her husband could provide, but they're getting old enough to need more structured learning. Jake nodded, familiar with the challenges faced by frontier families who recognized the value of education but lacked access to qualified teachers or established schools. The Campbell Ranch was prosperous enough to afford private instruction for their grandchildren, a luxury that most homesteaders couldn't contemplate, but that spoke well of their priorities and values. "You enjoy teaching?" Jake asked, genuinely curious about Emma's attitude toward work that many people found either deeply fulfilling or intensely frustrating, depending on their temperament and circumstances. Emma paused in her work to consider the question, her hands stilling on the rope she'd been adjusting, as if the inquiry required more thought than she'd expected to give to such a straightforward topic. "I'm good at it," she said finally, her response carefully avoiding any emotional evaluation of the work itself. "Children seem to learn when I teach them. Parents are generally satisfied with the results. It's honest work that pays adequately and requires skills I possess." The clinical description struck Jake as oddly lifeless for someone discussing their chosen profession, lacking any indication of passion or personal satisfaction that might explain why someone would choose teaching over other available forms of employment. Emma spoke of her work the way Jake might describe maintaining his equipment or tending his animals, as necessary tasks that served practical purposes without necessarily providing emotional fulfillment. "But do you enjoy it?" Jake pressed, surprised by his own persistence in pursuing a topic that was clearly making Emma uncomfortable. Something about her careful emotional distance intrigued him in ways that had nothing to do with mere curiosity about a stranger's circumstances. Emma finished securing the rope before answering, her movements deliberate and controlled, as if physical tasks provided refuge from questions that probed too deeply into territory she preferred to keep private. "Enjoyment seems like an indulgence I can't afford," she said quietly, her words carrying the weight of someone who had learned to measure life in terms of survival rather than satisfaction. "I do what needs to be done. I perform the tasks required to maintain my independence and security. Whether I enjoy them seems less important than whether I can continue doing them." Jake understood that philosophy completely, having lived by similar principles for the past 3 years. Survival required a kind of emotional discipline that left little room for the luxury of personal preference or the pursuit of happiness for its own sake. But hearing his own approach to life articulated by someone else made it sound somehow diminished, as if they were both settling for existence when life might offer something more substantial. The wagon secured to their mutual satisfaction, Jake turned his attention to preparing Storm for the journey to the Campbell Ranch. The mare stood patiently while he adjusted her tack, adding the additional rigging necessary to carry two riders safely over terrain that would challenge even an experienced mountain horse. Emma watched his preparations with the attention of someone genuinely interested in learning from skilled work, her questions revealing a practical intelligence that Jake found refreshing after years of solitude. She asked about the horse's training. about the specific challenges of mountain travel, about the techniques Jake used to maintain his equipment in conditions that would destroy lesser gear in a matter of months. "You really have been living alone up there," Emma observed, her comment, carrying no judgment but obvious recognition of the self-sufficiency required for extended isolation in such demanding circumstances. 3 years, Jake confirmed, checking the security of the saddlebags that would carry Emma's essential belongings. "Took some adjustment at first, but you learned to adapt." Emma nodded as if his statement confirmed something she'd already suspected about his character or circumstances. Jake found himself wondering what conclusion she'd drawn about his reasons for choosing such extreme isolation, whether she assumed he was hiding from the law or nursing wounds that required solitude for healing. "What made you choose the mountains?" Emma asked, her question carrying the careful neutrality of someone who understood that such inquiries might probe sensitive territory, but who was genuinely curious about motivations that seemed to parallel her own. Jake paused in his work, considering how much of his history he was willing to share with this stranger who seemed to understand emotional isolation from personal experience. The question touched on territory he'd avoided discussing with anyone. For 3 years, memories and choices that had driven him to seek the kind of extreme solitude that few people could understand or appreciate. "Needed space to think," Jake said finally, settling on an answer that was truthful without being complete. "The mountains provide that better than anywhere else I've found." Emma accepted his response without pressing for additional details, apparently understanding that some explanations required more trust and familiarity than they'd yet established. Jake appreciated her restraint, recognizing in it the same respect for personal boundaries that he tried to maintain in his own interactions with the few people his solitary life occasionally required him to encounter. "Ready?" Jake asked, gesturing toward Storm, who stood saddled and ready for the journey to the Campbell Ranch. Emma nodded, gathering her selected belongings and approaching the horse with the careful movements of someone not entirely comfortable around large animals, but determined not to let inexperience prevent her from accepting necessary assistance. Jake mounted first, settling himself in the saddle before extending a hand to help Emma up behind him. She accepted his assistance with the same careful dignity she brought to every other aspect of their interaction, maintaining her balance and composure even as she found herself in the unfamiliar position of riding double on a horse trained for mountain terrain. "Hold on," Jake instructed as Emma settled herself behind him, her hands resting lightly on his shoulders with the tentative touch of someone uncertain about appropriate contact between strangers. "The trail gets rough in places, and Storm's used to adjusting for sudden changes in footing." Emma's grip tightened slightly as Storm began moving, her initial nervousness about horseback travel gradually giving way to confidence as she adapted to the animal's steady rhythm and sure-footed progress over terrain that would have been challenging for someone traveling on foot. The trail to the Campbell Ranch wound through some of the most beautiful country in Colorado Territory, following Silver Creek through stands of aspen and cottonwood that had turned brilliant gold and orange with the advancing autumn season. Jake found himself seeing the landscape through Emma's eyes, noting details that his familiarity with the region had rendered invisible through long exposure. The morning air was crisp and clear, carrying the scent of pine and sage and the promise of winter that would arrive sooner than anyone wanted, but with the inevitability that characterized all seasonal changes in mountain country. Storm moved with the confidence of a horse that knew the trail well, her ears forward and alert, but her pace steady and unhurried despite the additional weight of a second rider. Jake became aware of Emma's presence behind him in ways that had nothing to do with the practical considerations of maintaining balance and ensuring her safety during the ride. The warmth of her body against his back, the subtle shift of her weight as she adjusted to Storm's movement, the occasional brush of her breath against his neck when the horse's motion brought them into closer contact than either had anticipated. It had been 3 years since Jake had experienced any kind of physical proximity to another human being. 3 years of isolation so complete that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be aware of someone else's presence in ways that went beyond mere visual or auditory recognition. Emma's touch was light and careful, respectful of boundaries while maintaining the contact necessary for safe travel. but it awakened sensations that Jake had thought were permanently buried under layers of emotional numbness and deliberate detachment. "It's beautiful country," Emma said quietly, her voice carrying a note of genuine appreciation that was the first spontaneous positive emotion Jake had heard her express since their meeting. Jake followed her gaze across the valley spread out below them, seeing the familiar landscape with fresh eyes that took in the dramatic sweep of mountains rising against the autumn sky, the golden carpet of changing leaves that covered the hillsides, the silver thread of the creek winding through meadows that would soon be covered with snow but were still green and lush despite the advancing season. "Best I've found," Jake agreed, surprised by how much pleasure he took in sharing his appreciation for the mountain country with someone who seemed to understand its appeal. "Takes some getting used to, but there's something about the scale of it that makes human troubles seem smaller." Emma was quiet for a long moment, apparently contemplating his observation about the relationship between landscape and perspective, about the way vast spaces could provide relief from the kinds of problems that seemed overwhelming when viewed from the confined perspective of civilized society. "How small do troubles have to get before they disappear entirely?" she asked, her question carrying the weight of someone who had tested the limits of geographical escape as a solution to personal difficulties. Jake considered her question seriously, recognizing in it the same hope that had driven him into the mountains 3 years earlier, the belief that sufficient distance and isolation might eventually provide relief from pain that seemed otherwise permanent and overwhelming. "They never disappear entirely," Jake said honestly, his answer emerging from 3 years of hard-won experience rather than theoretical speculation. "But they become manageable, less urgent. You learn to carry them without letting them carry you." Emma absorbed his response without comment, but Jake could feel some subtle shift in her posture that suggested his words had resonated with her own experience of trying to find ways to live with losses or regrets that couldn't be undone or forgotten. The trail began to descend toward the valley floor as they approached the final stretch of their journey to the Campbell Ranch, and Jake found himself reluctant to see their ride together come to an end. The conversation had awakened something in him that he'd thought was safely dormant, some capacity for human connection that had survived 3 years of deliberate isolation and was responding to Emma's presence in ways that were both welcome and unsettling. Emma Clark was clearly a woman with her own collection of troubles and disappointments, her own reasons for seeking fresh starts in unfamiliar territory, her own carefully constructed defenses against emotional vulnerability. But there was something about her quiet strength and obvious intelligence that appealed to Jake in ways that had nothing to do with physical attraction or romantic possibility and everything to do with recognition of a kindred spirit. For the first time in 3 years, Jake found himself genuinely interested in another person's welfare, concerned about her future prospects and success in her new position, curious about the experiences that had shaped her current approach to life and relationships. The feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying, a reminder of capacities for caring that he'd thought were safely buried, but that were apparently more resilient than he'd realized. As the Campbell Ranch buildings came into view ahead of them, Jake realized that this encounter with Emma Clark had changed something fundamental about his relationship with the isolation he'd chosen as his preferred way of living. The mountain solitude that had seemed like perfect sanctuary for the past 3 years now felt somehow incomplete, lacking some essential element that he hadn't realized was missing until he'd experienced a few hours of genuine human connection. The recognition was troubling precisely because it was so unexpected, undermining assumptions about his own needs and desires that had seemed permanently settled. Jake had thought he'd found peace in his mountain retreat, had believed that solitude provided everything necessary for whatever remained of his life. But Emma's presence had revealed possibilities for connection and communication that suggested his isolation might be more choice than necessity, more protection than preference. Storm's hooves echoed against the wooden planks of the bridge that crossed Silver Creek just before the final approach to the Campbell Ranch, the sound marking their transition from wilderness trail to the civilized precincts of one of the most successful homesteads in Clearwater Valley. Jake could see people moving around the ranch buildings ahead, going about the daily business of maintaining the kind of operation that had made Henry and Ruth Campbell pillars of the local community. Soon he would deliver Emma to her new employers. would see her safely established in the position that represented her best hope for security and independence in Colorado territory. His obligation to help a stranded traveler would be fulfilled, his duty as a decent human being completed according to any reasonable standard of frontier hospitality and mutual aid. But as they approached the end of their journey together, Jake found himself hoping that this wouldn't be the last time he saw Emma Clark, that somehow their paths might cross again under circumstances that would allow for the kind of deeper conversation and connection that their brief acquaintance had only begun to explore. Part 5. Revealing wounds. The Campbell Ranch spread across the prime bottomland of Clearwater Valley like a testament to what could be accomplished through hard work, careful planning, and the kind of stubborn determination that had driven thousands of families westward in search of opportunities unavailable in the more settled regions of the country. The main house was a substantial two-story structure built from local timber and native stone, designed to withstand the harsh winters and violent storms that characterize Colorado weather while providing comfort and security for multiple generations of the family that had claimed this land as their permanent home. Outbuildings dotted the immediate area around the main house, each one serving specific functions necessary for the operation of a successful ranch. The barn was large enough to house the horses and cattle that formed the foundation of the Campbell family's prosperity, while smaller structures provided storage for grain and hay, workspace for equipment maintenance and repair, and living quarters for the hands who helped maintain the extensive operation that kept the ranch profitable year after year. Jake had known Henry and Ruth Campbell by reputation for several years, though his self-imposed isolation had prevented the kind of social interaction that might have developed their acquaintance into genuine friendship. They were respected throughout the territory as fair employers and generous neighbors, the kind of people who had helped establish the moral foundation that made civilized life possible in regions where law enforcement was scarce and social order depended largely on individual character and community cooperation. As Storm carried Jake and Emma toward the main house, Jake could see figures emerging from various buildings to observe their approach with the curiosity that characterized rural communities where visitors were both welcome and noteworthy. The Campbell Ranch was prosperous enough to employ several full-time hands, and Jake could see men pausing in their work to watch the arrival of the woman who had been hired to provide education for the Campbell grandchildren. Emma's grip on Jake's shoulders tightened slightly as they approached the house, and he could feel tension radiating through her body that suggested nervousness about meeting her new employers and beginning work in an unfamiliar environment. Jake understood her apprehension completely, remembering his own discomfort during the few social interactions his mountain isolation had occasionally required. "They're good people," Jake said quietly, offering whatever reassurance might be helpful as Emma prepared to begin this new chapter of her life. "The Campbells have a reputation for treating everyone fairly, and they wouldn't have hired you if they didn't think you were qualified for the position." Emma nodded, but Jake could sense that his words provided only limited comfort against whatever fears or doubts were contributing to her obvious nervousness. Starting over in a new place with strangers required a kind of courage that had nothing to do with physical bravery and everything to do with emotional resilience, the willingness to make oneself vulnerable to judgment and possible rejection in pursuit of security and belonging. Jake reined Storm to a halt near the main house, dismounting first before extending a hand to help Emma down from the horse's back. She accepted his assistance with the same careful dignity she'd maintained throughout their journey, but he could see uncertainty in her expression as she surveyed her new surroundings and prepared to meet the people who would determine her immediate future. The front door of the main house opened before they could approach, revealing a woman in her early 60s whose silver hair and weathered hands spoke of decades spent in the demanding work of frontier life. Ruth Campbell moved with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to managing complex household operations while maintaining the kind of hospitality that had made the Campbell Ranch famous throughout the territory for its welcome to travelers and those in need of assistance. "You must be Miss Clark," Ruth said warmly, her voice carrying genuine pleasure at Emma's arrival. "We've been expecting you for several days now. I was beginning to worry that something might have happened to delay your journey." Emma straightened her shoulders and moved forward to meet her new employer, her posture reflecting the kind of formal politeness that suggested either natural reserve or careful training in appropriate social behavior. Jake watched the interaction with interest, noting the way Emma's demeanor shifted subtly as she transitioned from travel companion to employee meeting her employer for the first time. "Mrs. Campbell," Emma replied, her voice carrying the controlled warmth of someone making a conscious effort to create a positive first impression. "I apologize for the delay. I encountered some difficulties with my transportation that required assistance to resolve." Ruth's gaze shifted to Jake with obvious curiosity about his role in Emma's arrival at the ranch, and he found himself the object of the kind of friendly scrutiny that characterized small communities where everyone was interested in everyone else's business as a matter of both social connection and practical necessity. "Jake Morrison," Ruth said with obvious recognition, her voice carrying surprise at seeing the mountain hermit in the company of their new employee. "I haven't seen you in the valley for quite some time. How are you managing up on the mountain?" Jake removed his hat in response to Ruth's greeting, aware that his appearance probably suggested someone who had been managing rather poorly during his extended isolation from civilized society. His clothes were clean but worn, his beard unkempt, and his general demeanor probably struck most people as that of someone who had spent too much time alone and might have lost some of the social skills necessary for polite interaction. "Well enough, ma'am," Jake replied, keeping his response brief in accordance with his usual preference for minimal conversation during his rare encounters with valley residents. "Found Miss Clark stranded by the creek this morning. Her wagon got stuck in the mud and her horses ran off during the night." Ruth's expression shifted to immediate concern for Emma's welfare, the kind of automatic maternal response that had probably made her an ideal employer for someone seeking security and stability in unfamiliar surroundings. Jake could see her, making rapid mental calculations about Emma's immediate needs and the practical steps required to ensure her comfort and successful integration into the Campbell household. "How terrible," Ruth said, her attention focusing entirely on Emma's welfare. "You must be exhausted and worried sick about your belongings. Please, come inside immediately. We can deal with the practical details once you've had a chance to rest and refresh yourself." Emma accepted Ruth's invitation with obvious relief, but Jake noticed that she glanced back toward him with an expression that might have been gratitude or regret, or some combination of emotions too complex to categorize easily. Their brief journey together had created a connection that neither had anticipated, and Jake could see that Emma was as uncertain as he was about how to conclude their interaction appropriately. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Morrison," Emma said formally, her words carrying layers of meaning that extended far beyond simple gratitude for practical help. "I'm very grateful for your kindness to a stranger." Jake nodded in acknowledgement of her thanks, but found himself reluctant to simply ride away without some indication that their paths might cross again under circumstances that would allow for the kind of deeper conversation their brief acquaintance had suggested might be possible. Emma had awakened something in him that 3 years of isolation hadn't completely extinguished, some capacity for human connection that was responding to her presence in ways that challenged his assumptions about his own needs and desires. "If you need help retrieving your wagon and belongings," Jake offered, surprised by his own willingness to extend their interaction beyond the minimum required by common courtesy, "I could ride back out there in a day or two, see if your horses have returned or if the wagon needs additional attention." Emma's expression brightened slightly at his offer, the first genuinely positive emotion Jake had seen her display since their initial meeting by Silver Creek. The change transformed her face in ways that suggested whatever experiences had taught her to suppress hope and enthusiasm hadn't completely eliminated her capacity for both. "That would be very kind," Emma replied, her voice carrying warmth that seemed more natural and spontaneous than the careful politeness she'd maintained during most of their conversation. "I would appreciate any assistance you could provide." Ruth Campbell had been observing this exchange with the alert interest of someone who had spent decades reading human nature and understanding the subtle currents that flowed between people in various circumstances. Jake could see her making mental notes about the interaction between her new employee and the mountain hermit, drawing conclusions that she might share with her husband later during their private discussions about ranch business and valley gossip. "Mr. Morrison," Ruth said, her voice carrying the kind of gentle authority that had probably made her an effective manager of household operations and family relationships for most of her adult life. "You're welcome to stay for dinner if you'd like." Henry would enjoy hearing news from the mountain country, and it's been too long since we've had the pleasure of your company. Jake felt unexpected temptation to accept Ruth's invitation, drawn by the prospect of extending his time in Emma's company and experiencing the kind of civilized social interaction he'd avoided for 3 years. The Campbell Ranch represented everything he'd abandoned when he chose mountain isolation, the warmth and security and sense of belonging that came from being part of a community where people cared about each other's welfare and shared in both joys and sorrows. But accepting Ruth's hospitality would require social skills that Jake wasn't certain he still possessed after 3 years of solitude, would demand the kind of conversation and emotional engagement that he'd deliberately avoided since retreating to his mountain sanctuary. The prospect was both appealing and terrifying, offering possibilities for connection while threatening the carefully constructed walls that had protected him from further emotional damage. "That's kind of you, ma'am," Jake said finally, his decision emerging from some deep instinct for self-preservation that overruled his desire to remain in Emma's presence. "But I should be getting back before the weather changes. Mountain storms can come up fast this time of year." Ruth nodded understanding, though Jake could see disappointment in her expression that suggested she'd hoped to facilitate whatever connection seemed to be developing between her new employee and the solitary mountain man. Emma's face reflected similar disappointment, though she was careful to keep her expression neutral in front of her new employer. "Perhaps another time," Ruth said graciously, leaving the door open for future social interaction while respecting Jake's apparent need to maintain his distance from Valley society. "You're always welcome at the Campbell Ranch, Mr. Morrison. Please don't hesitate to visit whenever you're in the area." Jake mounted Storm and prepared to begin the return journey to his mountain cabin, but found himself reluctant to leave without some final exchange with Emma that might preserve the possibility of future connection. She stood beside Ruth Campbell on the front porch of the ranch house, looking smaller and more vulnerable than she had during their journey together, as if his departure was removing some source of support or understanding that she'd come to value during their brief acquaintance. "I'll check on your wagon in a few days," Jake promised, his words directed to Emma, but spoken loudly enough for Ruth to hear and understand the nature of his commitment. "Make sure everything's secure and see if your horses have wandered back to familiar territory." Emma's expression brightened at this concrete promise of future contact, her relief at having established some ongoing connection with the outside world obvious despite her efforts to maintain appropriate emotional reserve. In front of her new employer, Jake realized that Emma's isolation and displacement might be as complete as his own, that she might be as starved for genuine human connection as he was discovering himself to be. "Thank you," Emma said simply, her words carrying depths of gratitude that extended far beyond appreciation for practical assistance with transportation difficulties. Jake touched the brim of his hat in farewell and guided Storm away from the Campbell Ranch, fighting the impulse to look back at the woman who had disrupted his carefully ordered solitude and awakened possibilities he'd thought were permanently buried. The return journey to his mountain cabin would provide time to process the morning's events and their implications for the isolated existence he'd constructed as protection against the kind of emotional vulnerability that Emma's presence had exposed. But as Storm carried him away from the valley floor toward the familiar trails that led to his mountain sanctuary, Jake found himself thinking not about the safety and predictability of his solitary life, but about the sound of Emma's voice when she'd thanked him for his kindness, about the warmth in her expression when he'd promised to check on her belongings, about the possibility that someone else in the world might understand the emotional landscape he'd been navigating alone for 3 years. The mountains had provided refuge when Jake needed escape from pain and responsibility that seemed overwhelming, but Emma's presence had suggested that isolation might no longer be the answer to questions he'd been asking about how to live with loss and disappointment. Her own obvious struggles with similar challenges had created a bridge between them that neither had expected, a connection that survived despite their mutual commitment to emotional self-protection. As Jake climbed toward his cabin through afternoon shadows that were already lengthening with the approach of autumn evening, He realized that his encounter with Emma Clark had changed something fundamental about his relationship with the solitude he'd chosen as his preferred way of existing. The mountain stillness that had seemed like perfect peace for 3 years now felt somehow incomplete, missing some essential element that he hadn't recognized until he'd experienced a few hours of genuine human understanding. The cabin waited for him exactly as he'd left it that morning. The same rough-hewn sanctuary that had sheltered him through 3 years of self-imposed exile from the world of human connection and emotional risk. But something about the familiar surroundings felt different now, as if Emma's presence had revealed possibilities for meaning and purpose that Jake had thought were permanently beyond his reach. For the first time in 3 years, Jake Morrison found himself questioning whether the isolation he'd chosen was really protection or whether it might be its own kind of prison, keeping him safe from further hurt while also preventing the kind of healing that could only happen through reconnection with the world he'd abandoned. Emma's quiet strength and obvious intelligence had reminded him of capacities for caring and communication that he'd thought were safely buried but that were apparently more resilient than he'd realized. Standing on his cabin porch as evening settled over the Colorado mountains, Jake realized that his simple mission to help a stranded traveler had evolved into something much more significant, a reminder that the human connections he'd been avoiding might be exactly what he needed to move beyond mere survival towards something that might eventually resemble actual living. Emma Clark had awakened possibilities that would be difficult to ignore, questions about the future that couldn't be answered from the safety of mountain solitude. The evening wind carried sounds from the valley below, reminders of the world of human activity and connection that Jake had abandoned 3 years earlier, but that no longer seemed as threatening or overwhelming as it once had. Emma's presence had suggested that there might be people in that world who understood isolation and loss from personal experience, who had learned to carry their own wounds with dignity while remaining open to possibilities for healing and growth. As Jake settled into his evening routine of tending animals and preparing for the night ahead, he found his thoughts returning repeatedly to the woman he'd left at the Campbell Ranch, wondering about her adjustment to new surroundings and responsibilities, curious about the experiences that had taught her to manage pain with such quiet grace. For the first time in 3 years, Jake found himself genuinely concerned about another person's welfare, and the feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying in its implications for the carefully ordered existence he'd constructed around his own emotional protection. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.